Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Well, welcome to tonight's debate. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. Before we kick off with the emergency debate, there are a few notices. Firstly, as I hope you're all aware, and I hope you've all had a fantastic time at the union for the last 2 weeks, our discounted membership period ends at midnight tomorrow night. So if you've not yet joined, do make sure you join before the prices go up. Secondly, tonight in the bar after the debate, Cadenza, a fantastic a cappella band, if you don't yet know them, are going to be singing in the bar, and I really recommend that everyone head there after the debate, grab a drink and enjoy the music. And thirdly, we're beginning to organise our programme of speakers and debates for Lent, and if you're interested in getting involved in writing to speakers, thinking about who to invite, liaising with the speakers, please do email Leo Kirby on speakerselect@cus.org, and he'll give you some more information as to how you can get involved. So tonight's emergency debate is a bit different. It forms part of a series of debates being held throughout the country, being organised by the debate charity IDEA, called the Big Animal Research Debate. So universities, debating societies across the country are all going to be debating the same motion this week, and that motion is, this House would ban all forms of animal testing. Speeches will be 6 minutes long, with a minute of protected speech at either side, during which no points of information can be made. But there will also be the standard part in the middle of the debate in which some people can raise points of information as they want. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome the first speaker for the proposition, Arya Mishra. Arya is a first-year English student at Downing. Is it on? Okay.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to define this debate as basically any animal that is as cute as this, who the opposition want to cruelly slaughter and test on. But in a more serious way, we do think that animals that have physiological, behavioral, and anatomical tendencies that are similar to humans, and on a moralistic sense, those that even don't, do have a right to not be tested on. They have equal rights. So I'm going to be bringing you 3 points, and then Ted is going to be expanding on some of them and rebutting. So firstly, if we accept that animals can behave in the same way as us, so they recoil from pain, they express fear and pleasure, then they also share similar characteristics to humans. So if our argument for humans is that we have a moral worth for existing, then we have to accept that to discriminate against animals is analogous to discriminating on the basis of any other morally arbitrary characteristic, such as race or sex. And so basically, what we think on Team Proposition is that if those things are wrong, if racial discrimination is wrong and sexual discrimination is wrong, and we widely agree with that, then so too is speciesism, which is why we firmly believe that Team Opposition is in the wrong today. And if we move on to the second point, the European Commission in 1997 did a study which showed that on average every single year 115 million animals are euthanized, because obviously once you test on an animal they can't be released back into the wild. We think that there is really no justifiable basis, although they will bring you questions of science and logic and tell you that basically from a utilitarian point of view, there is no need for us to not test on animals. We think that animal research necessitates harm and as such is never justifiable. So a lot of people will say that behavioral studies like Skinner's test on pigeons really had no harm or created no kind of death, but the fact is those pigeons were of course euthanized, and while they may not be as cute as the monkey that I held up, we still think that they have a right to exist. So animal research, we think, because it does necessitate harm and because there really is no way around killing animals, is never truly justifiable. Point 3. In 2011, Peter did a study which basically showed us that we don't need animal testing. So what has come out now through innovation is the fact that you can actually test on live tissue cultures. And that's obviously a lot more kind of productive and a lot more reliable, because live tissue cultures show us a lot more closely how the human body is likely to react. So, if we don't actually have a need to test on animals, then we bring you the question of why we should. I'll take you in a minute. And so we obviously have a reasoning not to test on animals because we have an alternative available. Yes, Michael?
So the sole piece of evidence you've cited for this being universally unnecessary is a study by an animal rights charity. Vested interest?
Perhaps, but there have also been enough stats. Can I just point out that Michael's wearing a cummerbund and a bow tie also? But yes, it was from Peter. But yes, if you also go away and Google, you can find those figures. Peter obviously would go by the fact that they're going to find opposition. They obviously aren't kind of trying to just massage figures. So yeah, okay, moving on. And this is our fourth and final point about the positive social message that can be sent. So in countries, obviously, we have bans against animal cruelty, and we widely agree that there are certain ways in which animals should and should not be treated. But according to the 1986 Animal Scientific Procedures Act, certain companies are basically allowed to test on animals, and they have no legal damage, or they basically hold no legal liability. But there's obviously a clear moral contradiction in the law right here. So what we think is that if the law states in one circumstance that it is not okay to treat animals in a certain way, then that should be universally applied, and that should be a moral standing that is held throughout the law in any kind of circumstance. There should be no ifs and no buts and no exceptions, because as we've told you, animals do have certain rights. They do have we do have a vested interest to protect them. And so what we think is that this can send a really positive social message to everyone. If we think that kind of making bears dance is wrong or cockfighting is wrong, then we also think that the law should show that consistently throughout. Providing loopholes is exactly what gives companies the kind of exceptions that they need and the kind of moral, or not really moral, legal standing that they need to treat animals in a way that we think is quite frankly disturbing and disgusting. So today on Team Proposition, we tell you that because animals do have a right in the same way that humans have a right, because we've proved to you the moral standing, because we've showed you that they do not need to be killed, and because we think that this guy is really, really cute, we beg you to propose. Thank you.
Michael Dungokshin. Michael is a second-year mathematician at Trinity College and is also Treasurer of the Union.
Apologies for the penguin suit. I thought it might convince you all to take me a little bit more seriously. Goldie was a rather unimaginatively named golden hamster. She used to live at the end of my bed, and I hated her. And Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that's why I'm so proud to stand in opposition today. Two things I want to talk about in this speech. First off, why in some instances animal testing is justified, and secondly, why in those instances it is necessary. First, what is it we're standing for today in opposition? We're not standing for every instance of animal testing. We think that would be nonsense. Their motion, however, says that they want to ban all instances of animal testing. We think that's a problem because in certain circumstances it is necessary. We're not defending frivolous animal testing. Circuses are out. We're not defending animal testing on humanoids, right? Things like chimpanzees. But we are defending animal testing in the vast majority of instances in which it's used by the medical profession, which is typically on lab rats, mice, or fruit flies. We think in those instances it's utterly defensible and indeed a necessity for saving lives. So first off, why do we believe that this is justified? So the first thing to note is that it may well be true that animals have rights. But it is a pure fallacy to assume that, number one, all animals have equal rights to human beings, And number two, that all animals have equal rights to each other. We recognize the fact that in society we apportion rights very often according to your ability to respond to and make sense of external stimuli. That's why in certain circumstances, for instance, we allow people to commit assisted suicide, because we recognize the fact that when they made their decision to die, when they were fully sentient, fully self-conscious, that their former self should take precedence over their latter incapacitated self. We recognize the fact that people's ability to respond to stimuli is important in the apportionment of rights. We think that is significant. But more importantly, right, this notion is simply intuitive. You'd probably all be pretty annoyed were I to take a rat and throw it around the room. You'd probably all be even more annoyed and indeed deeply affronted were I to do that with a baby. And that's because we recognize that there is a special dignity accorded to human life because of human beings' special ability to respond to the world around them. And we think that in this debate is significant. Importantly, if I've convinced you there's even a slight inequality between human life and animal life, then we win this debate, because ultimately, as I'm going to show you later on, there is a trade-off here. Okay. Second thing to note about rights in general, both animal or human, is that they're not absolute. Thought experiment here. You have the choice between killing one person and saving 5, or letting 5 people die. The vast majority of people would save those 5 people because they recognize the fact that sometimes, in an imperfect world, we have to balance some rights against others. That's why we're often happy to go to war and kill people who don't consent to it, because we recognize the fact, no thank you, that very often rights need to be balanced. Similarly, we often impinge on people's privacy to defend their safety. Rights often do come into conflict, and we think we often have to weigh them up. So why is it necessary to weigh them up in these instances? So I'm going to tell you 2 things. I'm going to talk about high-intensity treatments where we need to use animals. I'm going to talk about noise in data analysis and how it's so important to use animals to avoid that, to get the best treatments to help people. Notably, I'm not just going to cite a study in explaining why this is necessary. I'm actually going to give you general systematic arguments that hopefully will be comprehensible to you, as opposed to simply referring to a black box of data produced by a charity with a vested interest. Okay, so first, high-intensity treatments. What sort of things am I talking about here? I'm talking about vaccines. I'm talking about chemotherapy. I'm talking about foundational research. Crucially, these are treatments that are often dangerous, often very important, and that often go wrong. To use human beings for these things would be practically impossible, because either lots of people would die, which I think we can all agree is a worse thing than lots of mice dying, but alternatively, right, people just wouldn't sign up to do it, and we wouldn't get the treatments that we all need for these very important conditions. Secondly, though, we also say that animals are often better suited inherently to medical testing. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, when you're doing science, it's not just enough to say, oh, that person got kind of better when they took the drug. You have to compare the person who's taking the drug to a control variable. That's someone who is as close to identical as that person as possible. With human beings, that's often very difficult because people, A, have different genetics, B, come from different environments, and C, live in different environments. The result is that the effect of your drug on someone who lives in Santa Monica, California, is presumably very different from someone who lives in the slums outside Rio de Janeiro, right? As a result, it's very important to standardize your test samples in medical trials. Indeed, it's of vital importance. Ted.
Are you suggesting that someone who lives in California and someone who lives in Rio de Janeiro are less similar to each other than a monkey?
Not at all. And I'm saying that at some point when we produce a drug, we will probably test it on human beings as well. But it's often very good to get that first foundational research, which is often more risky, done on animals, so that you don't cost unnecessary human lives. That would seem to be self-evident. Okay, so to avoid this statistical noise, we often get animals that we can put in readily comparable environments, namely identical cages, and that we can identify to have, design to have very similar genes and to grow up in very similar environments. The result is that we get better data so that we can ensure that our treatments are A, more effective, and B, have fewer side effects. That's important because these treatments very often treat millions and millions of people, and we want to be damn sure that nothing goes wrong. Look, do or don't use animal research. There's someone who's going to get a little bit pissed off. Do you want that to be a rat, or do you want that to be a human being? Oppose.
For speeches from the floor, and we'll take them in order of proposition, opposition, and then abstention. So if you have a point in proposition, please raise your hand, and someone with a microphone will come to you. Is there anyone? Okay. Could you say your name and college as well?
James from Sydney Sussex College. Sorry, this was the proposition, yeah? Yeah, incidentally, thanks for pointing out in your opening speech that you'd be ignoring arguments based on both logic and science in the opposing speeches. But first of all, I'd like to ask what you'd say to a person whose loved one had died from the lack of animal testing in a disease that could have been treated with animal testing. And also, I'd like to say, if you're going to argue against the death of flies and rats, what would you say to someone who would use lethal means to kill such pests in a kitchen?
Thank you very much. And does anyone have a point in opposition of the motion? To remind you of it, again, it's this House would ban all forms of animal testing.
No one in the doorway? Oh, come.
Beth from Emmanuel. And the point I'd like to make in opposition is that although the proposition promote using live tissue cultures, the fact is that the human body is vastly complicated. These drugs aren't just working on one particular tissue. They will bind to any tissue in the body that has those receptors. Now, we don't know what most proteins in the body do yet. We don't even know where they all go. So I would like to put to the proposition, if you're going to propose just using live tissues and then going straight to a human, and the drug you're using happens to have an effect on a different tissue in the body that is perhaps fatal, how would you explain that to the relatives of the people who are involved in your study? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is there a point in abstention of the motion? We'll come to you in a minute, I think. Sorry. Anyone in abstention? No? Okay. So anyone in proposition of the motion again?
Jack Lawrence from Homerton College. Just a point towards the opposition. Following on what the lady just said, because human bodies are so complicated, it's to my limited understanding that tests on animals don't always have the same effect on humans that they do on the animals. And you said something in your speech was that you're worried that if we did outright ban animal testing, there would be an issue of perhaps a lack of human volunteers. I think if I had a chronic illness of which there was no current cure, I'd sign up for any sort of research which would go for a cure. I actually think that there would be no issue, or if anything, it would be a directly proportional amount of volunteers for the disease, because if you had 1,000 people in the world who had a chronic disease with no cure, you'd potentially have 1,000 volunteers. And so you'd have just as many volunteers as for the importance of the disease. I actually think that with our current level of knowledge, perhaps there's a less of a need for animal testing, because we know if you pour acid on a rat, you'll end up with a skeleton. So that perhaps because our knowledge has advanced so much, in fact, morally, perhaps we have an obligation to phase out animal testing, and we only really need to test on humans.
Thank you very much, Jack. And does anyone have a point in opposition of the motion?
Stem cells on frame networks to paralyzed rats and has them moving again. Now that you can't do on cultures, and that you can't just do on a computer. You need to test those type of advances in medicine. It's very important we still have the ability to test on animals, especially in advancements like that. I think quite a lot of people sat in this room will know people who are paralyzed, or even can't, or even maybe blind, because you still need to test these on creatures, because some systems are similar in animals to ourselves. And I think you should consider more than just the vast amount of testing that you are ostensibly against.
Thank you very much. I know we have another point of opposition. I think I'll just ask if there are any abstention speakers first. And any proposition? I think there might be people in overflow room, so if we could get a mic to you, that would be great.
Oh, thank you. I'm Devin from Churchill College. My question to, I guess, the opposition, if I have this right. While I agree I'm from a science background and I understand the importance of using animal models because sometimes it's difficult to simulate, a tissue culture doesn't necessarily simulate what a full system will do. But isn't it possible that by allowing animal testing, we allow ourselves to be less creative? It's a little bit easier to just go with a system that's going to kill the rat because we don't need to work hard because we can kill the rat. Chemotherapy is one of the best systems we have for fighting cancer, but chemotherapy also kills the person who's doing it. So don't you think that by tightening restrictions on life and all life, we might actually further medicine by only being able to use cultures and therefore only propose medicines that are safe for cultures and therefore safe for humans?
Thank you very much, Devin. Now, could we please pass it back to the gentleman at the back who was going to speak before in opposition?
I'm Kieran from Christ's. I will actually support the proposition if you could give me a valid replacement for embryonic toxicology. It's been illegal to give anyone anything that's not been tested on embryonic in that test since thalidomide in the 60s. This gave hundreds and hundreds of people crippling disabilities. Yet with an embryonic toxicology test, I could show any of you in this room how to prove that drug is fundamentally unsafe. Yet it took scientists 50 years to work out why it does what it does.
Thank you very much. And finally, does anyone have another point in abstention of the motion? No, I think then we have to go back to the main speakers to finish off the debate. So I'd like to welcome Ted Loveday, who is a second-year law student at Gonville and Caius College, to finish off the case for the proposition.
So I think I'm going to begin by asking, what do you think it is that makes us human? Because I think that's what a lot of this debate has come down to. There's an argument that animals aren't the same as us because they're dumb, because they can't answer questions on maths or can't write poetry. In that case, we should test on dumb humans, and we should deny the rights, as Michael has said, to people who are not in a state of rationality. That's intuitively wrong. We think that's really important to respect humans. So it's not because they're stupid. And is it because animals don't feel pain? Of course it's not. Animals feel immense pain. Any one of you who has seen Michael Dungurkchen kicking a dog will know that animals feel a huge amount of pain. Any one of you who has seen Matt going to his lab and removing a fish from water and seeing it squirming on the ground like a fish out of water will know that animals feel pain. So it's not because they don't feel pain. And equally, if a human doesn't feel pain, we don't think this legitimizes attacking them. If a human is sleeping peacefully, we don't think this legitimizes killing them in the middle of the night before they realize they don't feel pain. It's still a bad thing. So it's not because animals don't feel pain. Is it because animals aren't cute? We have a few examples to prove that this is wrong. Observe Exhibit A. This cat was tested upon. His name was Tiddles, and he was used to test shampoo. Evidently, it was Pantene Pro V because it didn't work very well. But it's still a very cute cat. So animals are cute. Humans are cute too, but animals are cute. So it's not because they're not cute. Now, this idea has come up that maybe what sets animals apart is that they are unable to respond to stimuli. We've seen that the opposition hasn't responded to the stimuli of our arguments. We still respect them as humans. There are plenty of human beings who are quite slow at responding to stimuli. There are plenty of cats who, if you put a ball of wool in front of them, they will leap up much more quickly than a human possibly can. Does this mean that cats are superior to humans? No, it doesn't quite. Cats are great, but humans are set apart. And what it is that sets humans apart is that we care, is that we can feel sympathy for those who can't protect themselves, is that we can look after the weak, and we can look after human beings and animals who can't look after themselves, who can't stand up for themselves, who can't, no thank you, who can't sue pharmaceutical companies for giving them stuff that gives them an itch, and who can't do bad things to them. Animal testing, ladies and gentlemen, is torture. There is no doubt about it. It might be a question as to whether it's more acceptable to torture animals than humans, but it is torture. Because torture might involve constraining someone in a very narrow place and exposing them to extreme pain against their consent. Animals can't give consent. No thank you. Animals can't give consent. They're being tortured. And then Michael goes on to say that war is great, right? And because war is acceptable, no thank you, and because all kinds of things are acceptable for the greater good, we should just get on with it and do bad things to animals anyway. We think that it's part of being human not to do this, not to invade random countries just because someone in black tie with a posh voice tells us to do so. We think that in fact, no thank you, even if it was the case that we were cruel, hard-hearted utilitarians and believed that we should slaughter lots of animals for the sake of a couple of human beings' backache, we don't think this is the case. Animal research, my second point, is poor research, ladies and gentlemen, because the reason we want to test drugs is so that we can test them on something similar to what we're hoping to use them on. Let me give you a brief historical sketch. Animal testing first became popular in the West in the 16th and 17th centuries. Animal testing is the sort of thing that you would see those stuffy gentlemen at the Royal Society, drowning a budgerigar in order to demonstrate to their friends what a great, person they were. And it would be a dinner party entertainment, and they'd do big public lectures where they do it. And that might tell you a few things if you're a really primitive scientist. No, thank you, Michael. Might tell you a few things if you're a really primitive scientist, but it's crude. It is lazy. Scientists have fallen into a rut of thinking, okay, we'll slaughter a few thousand rats and a half dozen primates, and it'll all be okay. Drugs do not work that easily. For 90% of our research, no thank you, is fine-tuning. We already know that the basic recipe works. We're just trying to improve rates a tiny bit on the margins. Monkeys, even monkeys, are far too different to make that work with. But furthermore, for those that aren't fine-tuning, we want much more innovative methods. We want methods that involve genetic studies, in vitro studies, computerized studies, moving into the 21st century. Someone's pointed out Dr. Robert Langham at MIT. He's exactly the sort of person we don't want to use. He is a complete charlatan. He slaughtered 6,000 rats and 479 fish in one day. Do not believe Dr. Robert Langham at MIT. His methods don't work. One reason, no thank you, perhaps the most important reason why animal research is poor research is because it makes people more careful if they're testing it on human beings. Okay, you could test it on Goldie the goldfish. You're not going to take as much care to make your drug work as if you're testing it on your auntie. So we say animal research is not going to work. We want something that represents the sort of thing that is accurate and close to the original drug. We want to save lives. Too many people have died because, for example, animal research proved, because mice don't get lung cancer from smoking, that smoking is great. Animal research doesn't work. Move into the 21st century, and a few more exhibits to finish off my speech. Here is a nice rabbit. And here is another chimpanzee who begs you, please, 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 for his sake, if not for mine, propose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted. And finally, to close the case for the opposition, we have Matt Hazel. Matt is a vet at St. John's College, and is the convener of our school's debating competition. So let everyone please welcome Matt very warmly, please.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty convinced we're going to win this debate. Firstly, because I just want everyone who has any background in science to just take a moment to think about how manifestly idiotic everything Ted just said was. And secondly, because before coming into this debate, this morning actually, I had a free period, so I thought I'd just, test my speech on some rabbits. Only, compared to the control group, we only had about 50% increase in mortality. So, pretty good. So, before I actually give a speech, and I do have to give a speech, originally I just written down two things, which are 1, animal testing is best, 2, people greater than animals. But now I actually have to make arguments, which I'm kind of dissatisfied by, but I'll do it. So, firstly, floor speeches. The first one I want to talk about is the remarkably profound observation from the man over there, which is that humans, right, and I want you to just take a moment to think about this, humans are not the same as animals. Whoa. Yes, humans are not the same as animals. And the reason why this might be important is because what we do with animal testing is we test things that we think maybe it's not a good idea to just take this compound that we've literally just synthesized and give it to a load of random human beings. Maybe, here's an idea, we'll test it on animals first, and then when we go, now we know some more things about this compound, maybe then we can think about, maybe we should test this on humans. That's kind of how the testing process works. We go animals first, then we go humans if we think it's good, right? And also, not everything we test on animals is just a drug, right? So, yeah. Also, he goes, everyone would sign up if I've got like some life-threatening condition, like fine, but again, who's going to sign up for like vague theoretical research that might have some benefits like in a bit? Moreover, as I will point out again, and maybe I'll just do it now, right? Humans give you terrible data. Why? As Michael points out, and Ted seems to completely ignore, perhaps the biggest benefit of testing on mice is that I can get 100 genetically identical mice, stick them all in little sterile boxes, and control every single aspect of their life, which gives me like very little noise, no thank you, on my eventual data, right? That probably gives me better data than if I just tested some drug on everyone in this room and hope that there will be no confounding factors because presumably you are all different people, aren't all clones, live different lives. The other, perhaps more interesting floor speech, hang on, is from the lady over there who tells us that perhaps the biggest problem with this kind of model is that we have a lack of incentive to develop better technologies. Like, fair. Like, yeah, allow. But two things I would say to that. Firstly, like the tightening of regulations on what we can test on animals probably gives an incentive to do that. And moreover, you are correct, gentlemen over there, that animals are not the same as people. And perhaps if we could like create genetically identical tissue cultures that accurately model like most, if not all, of the functions of the human body without like being sentient and having to be afforded rights, which sounds pretty complicated, then like that would be better. So there are incentives to create better tissue culture models, even with this policy. So, right. Firstly, why animal testing is best. We're clearly not defending all kinds of animal testing, but like, as has been pointed out by everyone who did a floor speech who like did GCSE biology, right? Tissue cultures are not good because the body is made up of lots of different systems, right? So if I just test something on like a liver culture, even if it's a perfect liver culture, that tells me absolutely nothing about how it works in the heart. And you go, well, we'll just test everything. Well, like, firstly, these models aren't entirely accurate for every single system in the body. And secondly, we can't tell interactions between the two, right? So these things aren't purely additive. He says people, like we've explained, people are bad models because they're different, people wouldn't sign up. So the other alternative is presumably just not having medicine. And I think we're just going to come out and say we like medicine, right? So far we've had this argument about like, is animal testing like good on a vaguely scientific basis? And we think that anyone who is like, has some kind of semblance of like sentience and cognitive reasoning will side with us. Yeah, no, we've got that. Not yet. But I actually do think, like, in fairness to these guys, like, the motion does seem pretty odd because it's almost a truism that, you know, no one's going to be like, we shouldn't research like Parkinson's on Drosophila. Like, we probably just should. So I'm going to engage their ethics stuff, right? So I think they do make a reasonably legitimate claim when they say, look, the apportioning of rights is somewhat arbitrary to say, well, you know, you're a Homo sapiens, you're like Canis familiaris, so you don't get rights. Okay, that does seem arbitrary. But it's equally arbitrary to say that the sole criterion upon which you're basing the apportioning of rights is, capability to feel suffering, especially when their concept of suffering is like relatively ill-defined. Yeah, go on, why not? Knock yourself out.
So this thing about genetically identical mice, I don't get why you want a drug that works.
Right, so maybe you shouldn't have done a history degree. And then you'd understand why, right? If you really want to know, then degrade and apply for Bionatsky or something. I don't have time, but suffice to say it's true. So actually onto the ethics, which I think is like a fair debate, right? So the reason why we think it's similarly arbitrary for them is because the criterion on which they've decided to apportion rights is this idea of suffering. Note that suffering and the capability to feel suffering and pain is clearly not uniform across the animal kingdom, right? The difference between a human and a dog is like pretty large, but it's also true to say we have a spectrum going from mice to zebrafish to crabs to nematode worms, right? We're not sure that just because you're like vaguely able to feel suffering, that means you should be equated every single right possible. So we think clearly there has to be some spectrum where some people are apportioned some rights and other people are apportioned other rights on a scale, right? So we think that that's pretty arbitrary. And we think that if we're going to make arbitrary decisions, like maybe a good one will be to be, the utilitarian case, which these guys never responded to. They never responded to Michael's trolley problem, which is we do make rights calculations all the time. If it's a choice between one person dying and 5 people living, or just doing nothing and letting those 5 people die, we on this side of the house are perfectly happy to say, fine, we'll let that person die, because we think rights do exist in a balance and are never absolute. But even so, if we're going to make arbitrary calls, like, fine, we'll pick humans because we're entirely self-interested, and on opposition, we're pretty much fine with that. So, because we think animal testing just objectively leads to better science and better medical technology, and because we think that their metric for assigning rights is as arbitrary as ours, so that's at best a wash, and also because we're blatantly self-interested, we urge you to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now, and all the teams, in fact. So now it's time to take a vote. For the emergency debate, we traditionally do this by acclamation. So when I say, all those in favour of the proposition shout aye, and then when I say for the opposition, do the same, and then we'll decide by the loudest shout which side has it. So, all those who are in favour of banning all forms of animal testing, please make yourselves known. Okay, still for the proposition, because they think they've had it unfairly. 3, 2, 1. Aye. And for the opposition, 3, 2, 1. No! And all those in abstention? Brilliant, I think the noes have it.